Hello everyone, I'm Asha Nayaswami, and I'm going to be reading you a selection from my soon-to-be-published book, Swami Kriyananda, Lightbearer. The book will be available. You can pre-order it now, and it'll be shipped out probably at the end of May when the books arrive from the printer. They're on their way, even as we speak, this being the middle of, just before the middle of May 2019. I'm reading from the unbound galleys of the book that I received in advance. So the book is a chronological story of my 45 years with Swami Kriyananda, starting when I met him in '69 until his passing in 2013. I'm going to read now from the chapter 1970 to 71. I moved to Ananda, what is now Ananda Village. Then I moved and went to live at Ananda Meditation Retreat on June 1st, 1971. Conditions at the retreat when I arrived were simple, bordering on primitive. For 5 months I lived in a tent until an early snowfall forced me to move into something more substantial. Even then, with a few exceptions, substantial meant canvas teepees or small uninsulated cabins or trailers, no personal kitchen, no indoor plumbing. Water was carried in gallon jugs. Having even cold running water inside or a spigot closer than the water tower at the top of the hill was luxury living. We took our meals together in the dining room and bathed at the shower house. There was no electricity, except for a generator to pump water and run a blender in the main kitchen, if the cooks timed it right. We had wood for heat, propane for cooking, and kerosene for lighting. It was understood that no dwelling could be within sight or sound of any other. Most of the land was inaccessible, except on foot, by narrow, dusty trails. I grew up in suburbia. Later, I lived briefly in New York City and San Francisco, but mostly I stayed in the same environment in which I was raised. I never went camping and rarely even visited rural areas. I was always surrounded by people. Inwardly, though, I stood at the edge of the crowd, vainly trying to understand a world that had no meaning for me. I lived behind a psychic shield, erected so early in my life that I had forgotten it was there. Now, for the first time, I was surrounded by kindred spirits. Instead of shielding myself from my environment, I wanted to absorb it completely. The retreat was so remote that nothing unnatural intruded. Except for our few isolated dwellings, there was no sound or light except what nature offered. I had never considered the subtle influence of electricity, but removed from it now, I could feel my nervous system calming down. One benefit of no indoor plumbing was to take me outside at night when I would not otherwise have left my cozy room. For the first time, I saw phases of the moon, shifting constellations, sunsets, sunrises, and when winter came, rain and snow falling from a midnight sky, glorious, unexpected gifts. Subsequent generations of Ananda members sometimes marveled at the hardship we endured. Hardship? Everything before I moved to Ananda, that was hardship. Years later, I asked Swamiji a question about reincarnation, what causes it and how to avoid it. Longing and regret, he said simply. That is what brings you back life after life. Longing for what you never had or lost too soon, the desire for revenge to get even with those who wronged you, regret over missed opportunities, ill-considered actions you need to make right, all are equally binding. Concern lest desire trapped me once again. I said, I could repeat those first 10 years at Ananda in a heartbeat. It was heaven on earth. Swamiji smiled and said, oh, that's different. That longing is of the soul, not the ego. It doesn't bind, it liberates. During the week, Swamiji stayed at Ayodhya, a piece of property a few miles from the retreat. I'm skipping a few sections to go on in the same year. On the weekends, he stayed at the retreat to give classes, Sunday service, and private interviews for those who needed counseling. On Sunday afternoon, he would invite a few friends to his house for tea, which often extended into dinner and sometimes conversation well into the night. Soon I was spending every Sunday with him. An important principle of leadership, Swamiji said, is to give most of your energy to those who are most in tune. Leaders often try too hard to win over the negative ones. At best, you bring them to neutral, but as soon as you turn your back, they become negative again. Cultivate those with the capacity to become leaders themselves. Increase the positive magnetism in the center, and those with the ability to be in tune will be drawn in, and those for whom this isn't right will be spun out. I've let others develop the community in the way they think is important, buildings, planning, rules. Well, I have concentrated on the one thing I know is needed, the right spirit. When the spirit is right, everything else follows naturally. In the United States, especially on the west coast of California, the guru game was going strong. Self-declared enlightened masters were appearing on every corner with resumes that included past lives as saints and avatars. There are plenty of gurus, Swamiji said. What is needed now are examples of what it means to be a disciple. I've always felt I could do more good as a simple, unaffected friend than in any other role. He kept things informal, shunning all accoutrements of spiritual leadership to which he would naturally have been entitled. Awareness of his spiritual stature wasn't corporate policy. It had to come by intuition. Privately, a woman asked me, "It seems to me everything that happens at Ananda is because of Swamiji. Is that true?" "Yes, but don't tell anyone," I said. "It is better for people to discover it on their own." Respect for Swamiji meant cooperating with him in how he wanted to present himself. Whatever energy came to him in reverence or gratitude, he directed toward Master. Soon after he moved to Ayodhya, a woman named Mary and I were helping Swamiji clean out some files. We found notes of a reading from the Brighu Samhita. Brighu was an ancient sage of great renown. The Samhita is a collection of his prophecies, describing with astonishing accuracy thousands of people who would live centuries after him. Brighu spoke of Swamiji's future as a spiritual world leader, recognized and acclaimed by all. Like a gleeful teenager, Mary said, "Wow, that sounds terrific!" A look of deeper understanding passed between Swamiji and me. The simplicity of our life, the closeness of our small community, our almost daily contact with one another, Swamiji said quietly, "These are the good old days." It's hard for people who came to Swamiji in the last decade of his life to appreciate how different he was in those early years. He had this huge project to carry out. He was working at the beginning only in America, where there was this revolution of spiritual consciousness, the baby boomers, as they're called here, the 60s generation. And he presented himself very, very differently than he did much later when the pattern had been set, the majority of work had been done. But the unifying feature from the beginning to the end was Swamiji's absolute humility and complete indifference to the adulation of the masses. He never cultivated it, and he was never touched by it. He was always the same simple guy. There was a moment, which must be on a recording somewhere, when he had given a big program at Ananda village toward the end of his life, when there were several hundred people there at least every time he had a big event. And his talk was finished, but he was still wearing the microphone. And he got up and he was walking away with Jyotish and Devi and whoever was driving him back to his home there. And I think he didn't realize the microphone was still on. And he says just very cheerfully, referring to himself, well, time to take this nut home and put him back in his shell, is how he put it. And it was so perfectly Swamiji. He didn't know it would be broadcasted to the whole group. He was just calmly and sweetly speaking to his friends about the way he saw himself. He often talked about the fanfare that often accompanied him toward the end of his life. He said it felt to him like a symphony orchestra playing a great overture, and then finally the curtains part, and he says, and a little tiny gray mouse just comes wandering out. But it was no affectation. Compared to the infinite, compared to the greatness of his master, true humility is just seeing yourself as you really are. He was just a child of God from the beginning to the end of his life. A joy for all of us. God bless you.